Hi there, and welcome to the second Let's Talk Transition interactive market update from OGV Media Group. I'm Moray Melhuish, the founder and principal consultant at ANIC Consulting. I'm also, as you'll know, the host of the Let's Talk Transition podcast. I'm sure you know already, but ANIC supports companies growing in the offshore renewables industry, as well as providing interim project management. So, if you've not seen the podcast already, guys, this is it. And in the show, we meet founders, leaders, and innovators from across the energy transition. Here we are. Now, I'm really excited about today's show. I think we've got some terrific guests for you. I really do. Coming up, we've got David Linden, the Executive Director at energy intelligence provider Westwood Global, to tell us about the big picture of the industry. Then we've got Dan McGrail, Chief Executive at the Renewable Energy Trade Association, RenewableUK. Then Susie Lind, Managing Director of the developer Bluefloat Energy Renantis Partnership. And last but not least, Dan Jackson, Founding Director of the TOG developer Cerulean Winds. Now, remember everyone, this is an interactive show. So I'd like everybody to start telling me something about themselves in the chat box. So, can everybody tell me about yourselves? Here we go. Is there anybody there? So once we've had the first couple of messages in, we're going to bring David Linden in, our first guest. Well, it's a little bit quiet there just now. Tell you what, we're going to go straight ahead with David Linden. David, welcome to the show.
Hello, Moray. How you doing?
I'm pretty good. So, David, can you start by introducing yourself, please? Tell us a bit more about what Westwood Global Energy Group does and a little bit about yourself.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me on this. So for those of you who don't know, Westwood, we're, as I said, a market intelligence and advisory group. We've been sort of present in the offshore space, historically upstream, and I guess over the last sort of 15 years or so in offshore wind in particular. And, people come to us with, I guess, their biggest questions in terms of either how they're trying to transition or what opportunities the transition does present to them. And particularly related to the offshore wind industry, we have a tool, the WindLogix tool as it's called, that people can subscribe to get access and insight as to what's going on. And my role within Westwood, so I've been with Westwood for about 3 years or so now. I have a history in market intelligence and commercial kind of work. Worked at places like BP and other sort of market intelligence providers as well. But I joined this business about 3 years ago, really with the remit of trying to grow all our different energy transition offerings. So we do that, as I said, across the board, but mostly try and focus on some of our specialisms. So that's offshore wind, CCS, and hydrogen, specifically for energy transition.
Great. So you're well placed then to tell us a little bit more about the industry and how it's growing globally. So, tell me about the wind markets globally and, how does the UK fit in?
Perfect. Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Murray. It's, for folks who maybe don't know this industry, you end up sort of navel gazing a little bit or echo chambering. And so you sometimes forget the global context. So it's always useful to start with that. The origins of the industry, right, are European. It's a very European story. But it's also a very young story. So the first kind of wind turbines were not really installed until the early 90s. So 91, I think, the first of the Danish turbines were installed. And in the UK, where a lot of us on this call are sitting, it's I'm trying to think, it was 2003, I think, was the first commercial wind farm was actually commissioned. So, in the grand scheme of technology, energy, and the world and how it's evolved, this is a very new industry. And right now we're standing there at 65 gigawatts. So through that kind of 15, 20-year history, we have achieved 65 gigawatts of installed capacity in the world, and just under half of that, about 49%, if you want to be precise, is in Europe still. So the birthplace of the offshore wind industry. But then, kind of next in line, you've got mainland China, or China as such, which is looking at something like 47% of the rest of the capacity. So it's this kind of world right now where you've got a really big offshore wind industry in Europe, but then China sits very much behind that, just as the one country. And the rest of the kind of last few percent, that's around 4% or so, is kind of distributed in mostly sort of Southeast Asia and a little bit in the US. So highly concentrated in a couple of regions right now, and a few spatterings coming up across the world.
Great. So 65 gigawatts in the world, half's in Europe. And of the European percentage, what are what's the split between the UK and elsewhere?
Okay, so it's worth sort of thinking. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, until about a couple of years ago, the UK was the biggest market, and if you were to look at the top three in the world, let's just say you've got China, then UK, and then Germany. And so within Europe itself, you've got a relatively high concentration amongst a few countries, really based in Northwest Europe, so the North Sea focused side of things. So that's where the main focus is. And if you were to sort of think in the next sort of few years, that doesn't change too much, right? So the concentration that we're talking is still quite similar.
Okay, and in terms of how it's going to evolve, what additions are you expecting in the future, and which countries are you really expecting to see grow?
Yeah. Okay. Well, what's really happening is that while this has and is still a relatively, what I will call, concentrated industry, it's really growing both in scale and diversity in terms of where this is happening. So when I say scale, we're looking at, by 2030 having something like 350 or so gigawatts in the water relative to today's 65 or so. So there's a massive growth that's expected to happen. And as I said, so within the next 5 to 10 years, your top three doesn't change too much in some respects, but it's the scale of those growing. And if you then think about the rest of the world, suddenly you're seeing a whole range of different countries going. So, countries that you would expect really should have offshore wind, somewhere like Norway, is actually holding its first licensing round. Countries like Portugal, which in a mature region like Europe is also finally having its first leasing round. And in other countries that have kind of dipped their toes in with a few megawatts in the water, places like the US and Japan, they are going to really start to kick off more. But there's a time lag between leasing and building, right? We're talking like something like 10 years or so for that to happen, which is why that kind of top three doesn't change as much in the really near term. Longer term, though, you're really starting to see an explosion beyond that. We're looking at places like Brazil, Colombia, India, even Philippines, very exciting market. And so, give it that time lag. Things are happening now, but give it a little time lag. Things are really going to expand and explode, and it's going to become a proper global industry.
Okay, David, I'm taking a look at some of the comments coming through from LinkedIn, and we seem to be having some technical challenges. We've gone live, and yet we don't seem to be
live,
which is a little bit odd.
Okay.
Bear with us. Sorry, everyone. Seconds. No. I don't know what. Okay. Do you know what? Let's just pause there. 2 seconds.
Of course.
Oh, we've got Dan. 2 seconds.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, apologies, guys. Apparently, we're broadcasting on YouTube. There's a glitch with LinkedIn, so some of the interactivity is limited. The guys are working in the background to fix that, and apologies for the error there. I think what we'll do is we'll carry on, and then if we'll maybe bring you back again on the end of the show, David, just to cover some of that off again. So, David, you were just taking us through some of those emerging markets that you're watching. What's driving the growth and what's constraining the growth? Those are two of the questions that I'm really interested in.
Absolutely, yeah. No, thanks for that, Moray. I mean, there are several factors driving this, right? So essentially, you've got countries with net zero targets looking to try and find ways to decarbonize their sectors. If you're in sort of mature European markets, you've got a resource base, net zero targets, and a low cost kind of resource available that you essentially, makes a lot of sense if you're trying to reach in those targets. And so there's big target setting going on to try and decarbonize industries. Elsewhere in the world, it's really about also diversifying the kind of power that you have. In some respects, this is a little bit more base load. It's not fully base load, but more base load than some renewable technology. So folks are keen and interested in taking advantage of the wind resources they have. But also they've got companies moving. So somewhere like Taiwan, for example, has got companies moving there that are essentially quality off-takers that have net zero targets themselves. So these are corporates saying, look, I need you to give me high quality renewable power that I can use to decarbonize. And so, what are you doing about it, government, in some respects? But, flip side is it encourages, the developers to move in and go, look, I actually have a credible off-taker here. Let me invest here because we actually have someone who wants this power. So there's different drivers, but net zero at its kind of most core, and then you've got the demand of it from the kind of corporate angle, and each region has its own slight nuances, just depending on the stage of their development and what they're after.
Great, and what's holding back the capacity growth?
Good question. Sorry, I didn't answer that part of it, did I? Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say for the opportunity and why people are taking advantage of it, but it's kind of an interesting inflection point if you're going from, well, as I said, over 15 or so years, you've gone globally 65 or so gigawatts now. And if you think about, Europe has only gone 30, 35 or so in that time. Now you're trying to go up to 300 plus, in a very short period of time. The reality is it's a massive growth that's expected of this industry, and it's trying to do a lot in a short period of time. So it's coming across, some of the key macro factors such as cost inflation. So we at Westwood have done a cost inflation study recently just to highlight where the costs are rising, by how much and how much of an impact that's having. So if you are coming to Global Offshore Wind, you should come and listen to us at the Innovation Theatre on the Thursday, 11:15. My colleague Peter Lloyd-Williams is talking about that. That's a key output as a study because it really helps contextualize how important cost inflation is. So that's on the macro side, but then also how capacity is being auctioned, right? If you go all the way back, beforehand, it's such a nascent industry, you kind of almost could pick a site, talk to the government, put your turbines in place and contract for demand. Now people think they can make money out of it, right? And it's a competitive process. And the rules are changing, and it's not just about price anymore. Price is important, but it becomes an issue when you might not be able to reduce costs anymore. Instead, it's also non-price factors. So thinking about, supply chains, thinking about biodiversity, that makes the whole thing a lot more complicated. Permitting, consenting, so the government influencing and bringing all this on, it's just not quite there yet. A lot of discussion going on. How do you move that forward? And then generally things like supply chain bottlenecks. You're going from, 0.1 version to 1 to 2 to 3, etc. It becomes quite a complicated story as to where are the bottlenecks? How do I overcome those? Especially as you're starting to see regional pictures evolve with governments trying to protect their local areas, create jobs, localization, and all those sorts of things. It's both great, but also really difficult to deliver. So you have a lot of headwinds that the industry's got to work through. And you've got to question, well, what does that mean for the future of it and how fast it's going to grow?
Yeah, I suspect we'll be finding out more about those non-price factors later on from Dan and Susie.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. It's this question won't be a surprise. We've got a couple of floating wind developers coming up.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the opportunities that that floating wind presents?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm intrigued to see what both the in and the TOG discussion is on this, and we shouldn't forget. Obviously, those are quite unique in their own way, and be interesting to see. But I guess the overarching theme for floating wind is very much it is an early stage technology, right? So it's existed in many forms. There are lots of new players involved. Cerulean Winds, for example, and Renatus, etc. These are all relatively new players in the grand scheme of things. But it's an exciting space. There's a lot of really cool things happening. And ambition, appetite, etc. is huge. And the UK in particular, right? If you look at everything from Scotland, Intog, and Celtic Sea, these are all really exciting opportunities. The challenge is about deliverability, right? Because it is so new, it's competing against an existing fixed bottom world. Yes, of course, it has its own uniqueness about it. But if you're competing for capital, you're going to have to work out how bankable are you, and that's the issue. This is not necessarily a hugely bankable technology just yet, and they still have a lot to prove out to be able to get to the scale that's wanted. So we for example have recently reduced our forecast by I think it was 15 to 16 gigawatts by the end of this decade, and now we're looking at more like 11ish to 12 gigawatts, right? And there's a chunk, like there was a Trollwind project that was meant to come online by the end of this decade. That was a gigawatt that easily dropped out. But a lot of markets, there's just a bit more downside to the story right now. That's because of the macro picture and the difficulties there, but also the uniqueness of that floating wind market and the complexities around it. That's gonna slow things down a little bit.
Okay, yeah, that's it's not great, is it, when we're scaling back some of these forecasts? Tell me, oil and gas has been in the news a lot recently.
Yeah.
How important is that industry in driving the offshore wind industry?
Yeah, it's a great question. I remember, when it all first started, it was, in many ways, this is the oil and gas industries for the taking, and certainly from a supply chain technology know-how transfer side of things, and this is a massive plus. The oil and gas industry, is fundamental to making this industry work, right? There are so many overlaps that have made it essentially. I mean, the biggest offshore wind company in the world, Ørsted, was essentially an oil and gas company before, right? So if you think about it from that perspective, that's key. But a lot of the suppliers, they dip into both sides, whether it's cables or vessels or those sorts of things. They all overlap. But that's interesting. At the same time, there's the overlap, which means they also have a huge influence either way. Oil and gas is going through a boom again at this stage, however long-lived that is. But it's an important boom, and it does have longevity to it in some shape or form, and that impacts things. It impacts in terms of, port availability, vessel availability, rates, et cetera, and that's going to impact, the offshore wind industry and deliverability there. The oil and gas majors are important in investing in this space. They're going to be off takers in Intog, as an example, as I'm sure we'll hear. But they're also, world leaders. Someone like Equinor and the high wind side of things. That's been fundamental. But they are. I mean, if you look at, let's say, by 2030, our capacity kind of says they're only about 7% as the totality of the market, right? So, okay, it'll take time. They'll build up capacity. But as a totality, they're going to be as big as Ørsted. And that's all the different oil and gas players that we can count that they're involved. So they're important. They're making a difference. The supply chain is probably even more important. And then it's the dynamic of capital allocation that's going to really drive as to how important this really is. Are they drawing back from an energy transition? Are the companies that have a choice going back into oil and gas rather than offshore wind? It's a lot of questions that we're answering right now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's it'd be interesting to see how that plays out, won't it? And I think we're going to be learning a little bit more about that next week too at the event. I think there'll be lots. And in fact, thinking about next week, David, if you don't mind, I'm going to put you in the green room for a secid and for a few minutes, and I'm going to bring out our next guests. So, thank you very much for David for just now, David. That was brilliant.
No problems at all. Thanks, Moray.
All right, so now, guys, joining us, we've got Dan McGrail. Dan McGrail's Chief Executive at RenewableUK. Hey, Dan.
Hey.
Also joining us, we've got Dan Jackson, the founder of Cerulean Winds. Hi, Dan. And
good afternoon.
Hey, Susie.
Hi, great to be here.
Can you hear us? Oh, my apologies.
You have no new messages.
There we go. Hi, so Susie, the Managing Director of the Bluefloat Energy Renantis Partnership. So, can everybody hear me, first of all?
Loud and clear.
Fantastic. It's great to have you with us this afternoon. Thanks all for joining. So, look, I tell you what, Dan McGrail, let's start with you because really there's lots of excitement coming up, isn't there? Why don't we start, Dan? Tell us a little bit about yourself and RenewableUK.
I'm Dan McGrail, Chief Executive. I'm sorry, I've got an awful. That's good stuff.
Oh, I think we're maybe having a few glitches with Dan there. Dan, can you try that again? Can you hear us, Dan? Dan, we can't hear you. I tell you what we're going to do is we'll come back to you. And then
hear me now?
I can. Oh, yes, we can hear you again, Dan.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, yeah. Try again.
I'm just getting a terrible echo.
Yeah, I'm afraid you're breaking up there, Dan. My apologies. Look, what we're going to do is we're going to we'll maybe come back to you, Dan McGrail. We're going to go to Dan Jackson and Susie Lynn for just now. So there's lots of excitement in the industry. We've just been talking about the oil and gas industry, the global growth of offshore wind, and your companies, both of your developers, are not household names, but of course they're quickly becoming household names in the offshore wind industry. So I wonder if each of you could introduce yourselves and your companies, please. Susie, would you like to go first?
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Moray. So I'm Susie Lind. I lead the Bluefloat Energy Renantis Partnership here in the UK, and we have a floating offshore wind portfolio really that took off through the award of 3 ScotWind projects. So Bellrock, Broadshaw, and then together with Ørsted, Stromar. And then more recently, we were awarded 2 INTOG projects, Sinclair and Scarabin. And of course, we're eagerly awaiting the auction round in the Celtic Sea. So really our focus is on that 5 gigawatt pipeline that we're looking to deliver throughout the UK.
5 gigawatts, brilliant. Yes, that's exciting stuff. And Dan Jackson, tell us a little bit about yourself and Cerulean.
Yes, good afternoon, Moray. My name is Dan Jackson. I'm one of the founders of Cerulean Winds. Cerulean Winds is a green energy provider, particularly focused on floating offshore wind. In the INTOG process, we were fortunate to receive 3 large-scale floating offshore wind sites, and that formulates the NSR grid, which is an offshore electrification, generation and transmission system.
Yeah, and Dan, I should say welcome back to the podcast because, of course, even before the INTOG results were out. We were lucky enough to have you on, I think it was episode 2 or 3. I would have to check back, but welcome back. It's great to have you back again. So now I know that both of your projects are slightly different shapes, and of course you've got different strategies too. Susie, tell us, your 5 gigawatts, what does that mean? Give us a feel for it.
It means that we've got a lot to do, and it means that we are operating quite a number of projects on a very similar time frame.
Yeah.
But for us, that's an absolute opportunity. I might just take a minute to talk about our projects, Sinclair and Scaravan, and what that means for us, because of course they're adjacent to our ScotWind Broadshore project. And here we've got a massive opportunity to deliver them in an integrated way with Broadshore, so leverage synergies and team, but use them as a stepping stone and a chance to accelerate and really explore innovative opportunities around foundations, fabrication works, mooring systems, even the way we approach community ownership. And that was, of course, one of the factors on which we secured our innovation project. So I think that's super interesting, because this is not just about technology. This is about a kind of holistic view of projects and how they can be innovative, ultimately all to maximise the benefit to, in this case, Scotland, but hopefully in the future other parts of the UK as well.
Yeah, that's right. And of course it's possibly worth saying, because we talk about the INTOG round, and Scotland in recent times it's had ScotWind, which of course well-known, very large offshore wind portfolio of projects, which is wonderful. And then we had INTOG, which is either innovation or transforming oil and gas. Isn't that right? So there were 2 groups, and Susie, you were successful in 2 of those, which resulted in Sinclair and Scaravan under innovation. And Dan, you were successful in 3. That's right, isn't it? But under transforming oil and gas.
Targeted oil and gas, but yes.
Targeted oil and gas. My apologies. There we go.
Yes. Let me just expand on that a little bit. So the UK and the Scottish government, I think, have been very clearly aligned on their ambitions for industrial decarbonisation of the oil and gas sector. Documents such as the North Sea Transition Deal, which is over 2.5 years old now, 2 years old now, laid out those targets. INTOG and TOG was a big step in realising those targets, and lays out the groundwork for allocation of leases for decarbonisation of the oil and gas platforms. It's probably worth mentioning to those on the audience who don't know that most of the emissions from generating oil and gas production comes from the power generation on the platforms itself. So Cerulean has been working closely with a large number of the operators, literally hundreds of engagements with the operators over the last year and a half, to understand their needs and to build a solution that reflects their needs. And that ultimately what we're trying to do here is remove millions of tons of carbon dioxide. Very large problem for the oil and gas industry, and actually a very large problem for the governments that are set targets and they want to deliver on those targets. So we're very pleased with the results of INTOG, and we're very excited by the opportunity that is presented to have the first massive impact on decarbonisation in the UK.
Great. So 2 seconds. I'm just going to take a second just to. I've just noticed some comments coming through, Dan, which is brilliant. Now, the first one suggests that I should be buying the beers in London next week, but actually, Dan, given your success in INTOG, I think they're on you. And we've had Mohammed Ruman Ali. Hello. Nice to see you. Thank you for joining. Oh, he's from Bangladesh. There you go. Well, delighted to hear that we're getting an audience as far afield as Bangladesh. That's fantastic to know. And we've had a couple of users here. Kevin Morris, thank you for sharing the YouTube link. Paula, I'm really sorry that you've had some glitches and troubles. Thank you, everybody. Now, I know you're really interested in this, so keep your questions for Dan Jackson and Susie Lind coming, please. I'm going to try and bring back David Linden towards the end of the show again. And there we go. I've got a second vote. I think it's from the same user.
You're racking up quite the barbell here, Murray.
I know, it's quite a worry. There we go. Good. Justin's finally got logged in. Brilliant. And Wael Ahmed, thank you for joining us from Abu Dhabi offshore area in Egypt. He's from Egypt. There we go. Good. Somebody else from the Philippines. Gosh, there really is global interest in the offshore wind industry. Dan, you've got 3 projects, and they're going to be linked by basically a giant subsea ring main. Is that right?
So I'm perhaps explain a little bit here if they're given the opportunity. So the oil and gas industry needs flexibility. It needs to be able to access offshore power. Different operators have different timelines, have different demand requirements, they have all sorts of variants. So it's very difficult to bring them together as one. What you need, what is needed, and what we're providing is a piece of infrastructure as a grid, as an offshore grid, akin to how you use the onshore grid, but an offshore grid with power generation using green energy from floating offshore wind. So the oil and gas companies have all the things they need in terms of reliability, multiple generation sites, off a grid with all the backup they expect, 100% reliability, but also that flexibility for tenure, timing, demand, and also they can then plan the future because they have an offshore grid to connect into. So what we've done in terms of transmission is really, really important. Floating wind on its own is part of the story. Floating wind plus transmission gives you the solution. So our partnership with Frontier Power, which is one of the leading UK transmission companies, you may have seen in the press we've joint ventured with, is because, generation of floating wind green energy is one thing. Partnering with a company that can deliver the transmission system is very, very important. And what the oil and gas basin needs is flexibility in many, many regards, and they need reliability, and they do not need conditionality, which means that they just want to plug into the grid like you and I plug into the grid at home. They don't want to be responsible for how they deliver the grid or paying for the grid or anything like that. They just want to use the power and plug and play for what they use, and they want to know in the future that that grid's going to be there 100% of the time with the reliability that they expect.
Great. And of course, it's brilliant to see the two industries actually working together, because I think there's been a lot of talk recently about oil and gas being bad and offshore wind being good. But actually, as David Linden mentioned earlier, they do go hand in hand in many respects. Susie, thinking about benefits, we've been speaking, of course, about decarbonisation and reducing the carbon footprint of oil and gas. I saw that you were speaking at the SCDI's Summer Forum earlier this week. You've been busy, and you were speaking about what Scotland means for the wider economic prosperity in Scotland. Tell us, what does it mean?
Well, it means that Scotland's really taking centre stage once again, and it feels like a phenomenal opportunity to use that strong heritage of engineering and innovation in a different way. So for me, it feels like a completely unparalleled opportunity, obviously powered by the ambition that was shown in Scotland to deliver not just floating, but tremendous scale offshore wind. And of course, with that then brings opportunity for skills, jobs. I think it's really important that we are able to be as certain as we can be as to what the demand's going to be, what the kind of roles are, where the pathways into our sector will be, as well as the opportunities for supply chain that I know Dan touched on, so that everyone can position well to respond to that opportunity. So my hope is that we match that ambition with the ability to follow through. And we've seen some tremendous signs that the barriers that we have previously talked about in the renewable sector, like grid, like policy positioning, are being slowly but consistently tackled such that actually we'll be in a place to deliver. So for example, even seeing yesterday's announcement on Ofgem, and recognition of the fact that net zero will have to be a key factor in decision making there, or seeing further certainty on grid. All of these things we've said are absolutely crucial. So it's, for me, a really positive sign. But of course, as I'm sure we'll get on to talk about, there's a lot to do.
Great. And Dan, do you agree? Is that where the key of economic prosperity lies?
Okay, you got onto a good subject, which is what's in it for Scotland and particularly local supply chains. So the Cerulean project is the first floating wind that will hit the supply chain in Scotland. It's ahead of ScotWind. It's there to solve a problem that has urgency about it, which we've just discussed for the oil and gas industry. But what does that really mean? So the Cerulean scheme is multiple projects, and it gives a business line for those Scottish suppliers that are looking. One of the challenges from oil and gas, which we've learned, is project by project is difficult to justify investment. You have projects the scale of the Cerulean scheme, which is ahead of ScotWind, you have a business line so the investment can come in. But probably more importantly here is we down selected our prime partners, industrial partners in the Cerulean scheme a long time ago, a couple of years ago, worth sort of name checking them, people like NOV, they're the prime contractor for the foundations. They've been working hard with the Scottish supply chain, but they've been working hard with designs, with actual schedules that are on the table. So the businesses that they're talking to, which is pretty much every yard and every fabrication facility in Scotland, they can see it's real, right? It's not hypothetical and it's not template designs, they're actual designs. But what it really means, what it brings to Scotland is these designs we have designed it so it can be built in Scotland. We've designed it so that it can be assembled in Scotland. And more importantly, as importantly, we've designed it so it can be serviced in Scotland, right? So you've got to work within the constraints. You can't expect Scottish suppliers to have incredible investment cases. You have to have, they need an investment case because it's pivoting into a new business line, but the basis is all there. The offshore industry, construction supporting oil and gas, is second to none compared to any other industry, any other basin in oil and gas. It's all there. It just needs to pivot into renewables, but it doesn't need to be hampered by massive multi-billion-pound investments. We need to tune the designs that we have, particularly for floating offshore wind, to meet more or less what can be built. So I'm very excited by the subject. I'm very pleased that our industrial partners are very engaged with the Scottish supply chain, and we all had to do that because we're the first out the blocks in terms of the projects that are going to happen.
And remind me, Dan, 2028, is that first power? Is that
So the North Sea transition deal targets are 2027, 25%, and 2030 for 50% reduction in emissions. There's several ways emissions can be reduced from the oil and gas facilities, but the biggest bang for your buck is on the power generation.
Yep.
And you can make a big dent. I think we well in excess of 4 million tons of carbon dioxide just from the scheme as we have it today, with a lot of potential to increase that significantly just from the oil and gas industry alone. So what you're seeing is opportunity and talk being turned into reality here.
Great. When do you expect then the first turbine to be turning?
2027.
2027.
We will have to have electrons flowing in 2027 and 28. And that's the opportunity. We're trying to solve a very big problem for the industry and the government, and everybody's working together. You'll see the government bodies, the regulators, and the other agencies working with the supply chain and developers like Cerulean and others trying to solve this because it's there to be solved, right? And actually it's quite reasonable given when you look at the critical path analysis for an infrastructure project like this, things like getting the prime contractors in place, getting them working with the supply chain, getting all that on the table, that's normally critical path. We've done that piece. So, we're well ahead of the curve. We're not starting from 2023.
Yeah, sounds like a huge amount of work's been done already, Dan, which is great. I just want to take a second. I want to say hi to Irvin. Irvin's joined us from Peru today. And Robinson Guzman. Hey, Robinson, tell us where you're from. Tell us something about yourselves. And keep the questions coming through, guys. Justin Hoffman, you're on here. So let us have some questions, please. Be great to hear more. So, Susie, we were just hearing that Dan's got a really aggressive schedule. He's got his supply chain in place, but I think you've got quite a different strategy, don't you? You're taking a different approach to the projects. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Yes, so some of the decisions that Dan's obviously taken have not been taken for our projects, and we are keen and are actively exploring innovations across some of the things I talked about before, but a very wide range of project-specific elements. And because of that, and because we also have options around our route to market, we don't yet have certainty on our export dates, but we've got a commitment to make sure that they come as quickly as possible. It might be hydrogen, it might be connected, but certainly use it as a stepping stone to ScotWind. So the end of the decade is our plan.
Great, and it's not just about ScotWind and Intog, is it? Because we've got the Celtic Sea rounds coming, straight ahead. Tell us, are you involved?
We're very involved, and of course we'll know more as an industry about that process on the 4th of July when we've got the Crown Estate webinar. But we have 2 gigawatt projects in the Celtic Sea. We've got Petrock and Llewellyn. These projects have benefited, and we're leveraging our wider UK team, but we of course have our local team led by Gwenclean Elias, based in Cardiff, and a Cardiff office there. So we're really proud of the projects and the very advanced stage that they're at, so that we're well positioned for the auction round when it does come.
Brilliant. Now, I'm going to come back to you, Susie and Dan Jackson, because we've got Dan McGrail rejoined. So Dan, hey, can you hear us this time, Dan?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can, and it even sounds like the audio is stable now, which is brilliant.
Amazing. The show must go on, right, Moray?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dan, you were telling us a little bit about yourself and RenewableUK.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm Dan McGrail. I'm the chief exec of RenewableUK. And for those who don't know RenewableUK, we are the largest renewable energy trade association in the UK, principally the wind industry, but also tidal energy, green hydrogen production and storage. We support both onshore and offshore wind. And our membership, we've got about 500 companies in membership, all of the big developers that you'll be familiar with, representation from supply chain of all different types. So, the large turbine manufacturers at one end of the scale, the ports, but also things like the engineering consultancies, technology providers for things like autonomous vehicles and all that stuff. So we're out of the wind energy supply chain. My background is in that supply chain. I worked for Siemens, the big turbine manufacturer, for many years, running businesses around the world. And then I've been doing this job for 2 years now, so I'm loving it.
Yeah, I've got to say, I am really looking forward to the event. It is, it's brilliant for business, but it's also great fun catching up with, all these people that we know from the industry for so many years, old friends and new. I really look forward to it. Global Offshore Wind next week, Dan, what are the key themes you're expecting to see coming through?
So first of all, Global Offshore Wind is unbelievably 21 years old this year. So it's a bit of a milestone for the event. It will be the biggest event that we've ever held. We've got about 13,000 square meters of exhibition space at London's Excel Centre. We're expecting probably in excess of 6,000 people, about 50 nations, a number of trade delegations from around the world. Obviously very interested in learning what they can from the UK's leadership and deployment of offshore wind over the last 15 years or so. We're going to have about 200 different speakers, very diverse set of speakers as well, which is fantastic. We're numerous exhibitors, so it's a great place to visit to learn about the industry and also what's going on. In terms of key themes, the theme that we've had this year is securing our energy future, and I think security of supply has become, let's say, more relevant in the narrative around renewables in the last 12 months more than ever. If we go back a decade, we used to talk about the trilemma. It was a little bit unfashionable to talk about the trilemma now, but the premise of the trilemma was that you had renewables that were super expensive to reduce carbon. Then you had then you had to have other solutions to deliver security of supply. And so deal with the cost to the consumer. And the good thing is about renewables today, and the progress that we've made in offshore wind, is that actually all three elements of that trilemma are dealt with by deploying large quantities of offshore wind. But what is particularly relevant this year in that context is how we scale up. We've all of a sudden, and both Dan and Susie have been talking about floating offshore wind. One of the phenomena of the emergence of the application of floating offshore wind over the last 2 years, the size of the global pipeline for offshore wind has massively increased. I haven't got this year's figures yet, and I know my team will give me them before I go on stage next week. But between 21 and 22, the global pipeline doubled from about 400 gigawatts to about 850 gigawatts. And the main reason for that is that floating offshore wind has emerged as a credible application that people believe can drive down costs in the long run through scaling up. And that means that any country with a coastline can access, and wind can access a low carbon scalable technology, obviously. And as we were hearing about earlier, it really was a Northern European story, and also Chinese in areas which have particularly shallow water. So we've seen a real transformation in how let's say the upper limits of the industry into is about how do we scale this up? How do we get the industry to go bigger when we've got several barriers, not least the planning and consenting and the grid topics that have already been mentioned, but also just the economic sustainability, big downward pressures on costs driven by governments, rising costs in the supply chain due to inflation provoked by the war, and various other factors which make it challenging to do so. So, the next couple of years are really going to be around focusing on how do we get ready for this big bow wave of work that we anticipate through the second half of this decade and much of the next.
Great. Dan, I'm interested to ask you about the different regions of the UK. But first of all, Susie was just talking about the Celtic Sea project. And one of Susie's colleagues from Renantis, Gwynelian, has, hi there, thanks for joining us, has put this comment out there, which I think is really useful. Should anyone wish to hear more about the Bluefloat Energy and Renantis partnership, Celtic Sea floating offshore wind projects, Llewellyn and Petrock, please get in touch. And she's given us her email address there too. I'm sure you will be busy with some brilliant questions. And of course, if you've got some questions for our panel, do let us have them. Now, what else? Tell you what, should we we've got a few guys here. Alan Stewart, late to the party. Don't worry about Alan, it's brilliant to have you. Matthew, here we go. Such an exciting time for offshore wind in Northeast England and Scotland. Absolutely is, and Wales too, in fact. Some incredibly innovative solutions being worked on. Sounds amazing, Dan and Susie. I completely agree. Thanks, Matthew, appreciate it. Here we go. In fact, Dan, you might be able to help with this question. Thank you for sharing offshore insights. What is the expected life for offshore turbines? Dan McGrail, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, so I mean, when we started building offshore wind farms, we were thinking about 25 years. You can always life extend, but now many developers are assuming more like 35 years. So this is a kind of typical duration. But as often with all technologies and all power stations, you find a way to extend the life of it at the end of it. So I'm sure we'll innovate our way through it.
Great. And Susie and Dan, is 25 years? Is that what you're seeing from the supply chain that you're speaking to as well? Susie, do you want to go first?
Yes, but I think as you've just mentioned, Dan, there's a real opportunity to extend and push ourselves to make sure that we're getting as much bang for our buck in terms of output so that we meet our decarbonisation targets. So,
Yep. I actually think, sorry, Dan, go on.
Sorry, I was going to say, look, we fixed our turbine size at 15 megawatts because we fixed the design. When we fixed that about 2 years ago, which before the 15 megawatt turbine was available, and now we have several options of which we're progressing. But I actually have a different answer to this. I think there's an arms race going on in terms of turbine size and technology. So whilst we have a 50-year lease through the INTOG process for the NSR grid sites, I think we will be changing the turbines because of technology advances far sooner than they will be before they'll be wearing themselves out. And so you can see at the moment we have a race of about a megawatt a year in terms of increase in size, slightly more than a megawatt a year in terms of increase in turbine sizes. We're 200 miles offshore. We're not impacting, and there's not the same impact. We are impacting, but not the same impact as what you have when you're onshore or close to shore. So I think for the projects that are very far offshore, there's an opportunity to ride that technology wave and move from 20, 25, and who knows where it may go. And so I personally have the view that we will be retooling, resizing these wind farms far sooner than the technology expires.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And actually, Dan, I also wonder, when we start repowering those original wind farms that are out there, because some of these wind farms are out there with sort of 3 megawatt units, and those now seem tiny compared with even 15, let alone these future ones that'll be coming through as well. Brilliant. Let's just take another look, say some hi to some people. So Andre Lopez, he's in Brazil, it looks like, an offshore driller. We've got someone else was asking if there are if there are opportunities for chemists. I'm afraid I can't find the comment just now. There we go. Great to hear this. Do you have opportunity there for chemists from Namibia? Well, I think there's opportunity for just about everybody in this industry. It's certainly, just from what I can think of, we've got corrosion issues, we've got, paint protection. There's, I'm sure, lots of opportunities for chemists. Anybody else think of other applications in offshore wind they want to mention for chemists? No, there we go. So thank you for that. And who else should we bring in just now? Ross Gatt. Thank you very much, Ross, for coming on. Glad you're enjoying the update. Keep the questions coming through, please, Ross. And who else? Shame this one's from an anonymous user, because as a sector, mooring, there's strong desire to see standardization, particularly for operation and maintenance side of wind farms. I'm sure there is. Lots of interesting stuff to be done around moorings, in fact, especially for floating offshore wind farms, of course. So it'll be interesting to see how that comes along. And as I'm saying this, if anybody wants to join in and help with these.
Well, yeah, one thing on standardization, it's kind of it's an interesting area where we'll see, and it comes a little bit back to Dan's point before about the life of the turbines, swap things out. I mean, we're grappling a little bit as an industry with the arms race that's been referred to, because every time you move to a new generation of turbines, you get to a new bottleneck or a new limiting factor, such as the size of the heavy lift vessels that are required for them and things like that. So there are natural things that hold you back, and in that kind of scale up process. So there's actually sort of emerging debates out there about to the extent that you should start to standardize pretty much everything at a certain point in time. But I also think that with respect to floaters, we know that there's been there's a significant pipeline out there of floating foundation designs of different types, which will have different applications and different water depths. And we're quite early in this technology evolution. The filtering through of I think there's about 200 megawatts all ends up of floating wind turbines installed around the world at the moment. So there's still time for that. Let's say that what's the word I'm looking for? That filtering down of different applications to reach a more standardized world.
Great, thanks for that. And we've got another. Sorry, Susie.
Sorry, I might just add to that, because I think the key prize of standardization will be efficiency, to bring the sort of certainty that the other Dan talked about at the start, which will help us really understand, what can we deliver and when we can deliver it. And I think the certainty and realism is helping us be more specific with that, because he talked a little bit about a stepping back of output, but I'd rather contend that and say, actually, we're just bringing certainty, of which standardization is helping us accelerate and therefore achieve that. So I think it links all of these topics together.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Now, it's a shame this one's also from an anonymous LinkedIn user, but hi, thanks for joining us. We've seen requests for 35 and 40-year life from turbines. This has an impact on component replacement demand. Well, that's a good point, actually. If you are going to be owning a generating asset for 35 to 40 years, there is going to be considerable investment required in operations and maintenance. That will be. Are you able to tell us, Susie and Dan, where your operations and maintenance bases are likely to be, or is that still?
Let me do that, because I'm quite well progressed with this. Ours will have to be in Scotland. They should be in Scotland. Design them to go in and out of ports in Scotland, because actually we've missed on a number of subjects here. But in terms of what's in it for Scotland, the type of employment and jobs and opportunities for young people and careers for young people will be in the high-tech sector, service sector with offshore wind. Floating offshore wind is going to benefit tremendously in Scotland if we can develop the supply chain to service them over the next 50 years. You need 50 years for the economics for the wind farm to be attractive to the investment community, but that presents lots of opportunities as they repower, retool, and that's high-spec jobs across the sector and large numbers of high-spec jobs. So they will be coming into Scotland, because you don't want to tow these type of structures long distances. The one thing they're not designed to do is be towed in long distances. But I think it's part of this, where's the capabilities to fabricate, where's the capabilities to assemble. Services captures many things. These are very large structures, very far ashore, and very high tech, and they're only going to get more high tech. And that presents great opportunities for young people in Scotland.
Brilliant.
It's worth confirming, certainly we're of the same view. So our own O&M basis will be in Scotland also.
Yeah, I was going to add one point there, Moray, which is that just to maybe refer to the opportunity outside Scotland. We've got. It takes probably the maximum speed you can get to with towing a floating wind turbine is about 3 knots, or floating foundation. So you can't do anything over significant long distances. It has to be a local story, and it has to play out in local communities where the deployment happens. So that's a great, it's a great narrative for the industry to talk about job creation and high skilled jobs, high wage jobs, and also intellectual export in the future about how we make these things, how we put them together, and how we maintain them. But also just pointing out the role of the Celtic Sea, which we're about to see, the first tender. This will create big opportunities also in South Wales, also in the Northern Cornish coast. But the first Irish tenders have also taken place for offshore wind, fixed bottom offshore wind, very recently. Just cleared the auction a matter of weeks ago, and there is a great that creates also a bigger opportunity around the Irish Sea in the future, as well as around as well as the opportunities in Scotland. And the upper limits on the Celtic Sea installations are sort of north of 20 gigawatts, so comparable with ScotWind. And then in all of that, there's still a big role for the installations that we have in England, and we'll see future leasing rounds from the Crown Estate. Don't know when they will be. There's plenty of deployment to happen all around the United Kingdom.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, isn't it? That's for sure. We've got another question. We've got time for some more questions. We're just going to quickly go to a couple more LinkedIn users. So here's the first question. Are you looking for 17 separate operation and maintenance bases for Scotland, or 1, 2, or 3 from a shared facility? Dan Jackson, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I want to just take a step back a little bit. So what we talked a little bit about the many different types of technologies, both in the turbine technologies and the floaters, particularly the floaters. We down selected our prime contractors because they're the big they're the very large contractors that can take on these sort of turnkey contracts, and they're very used to building something very substantial and on offering the service contract goes with it. We saw that in oil and gas. We saw when deep water in 99 to 2003 had exactly the same dynamics as the offshore wind industry. We saw many different technologies consolidated into a small number of prime contractors that were able to package them up and offer them to the market. And they control not only the build and design, but also the service sector. So I personally think there will be a number of hubs in Scotland for servicing ScotWind and the Intog sites, and they will be controlled by a small number of prime contractors, very similar to what you see in the oil and gas space, where those contractors have our contractors have a responsibility for performance of their work, and that goes not just beyond sort of the first couple of years, but they'll be there for decades to come. So they're looking at the local infrastructure and building service bases that are very substantial, looking on a very long-term basis. And I'll just come back to it. The challenge and the opportunity is jobs for Scotland and high-spec jobs for Scotland and high-spec services that follow that.
And Susie, tell us, are you looking for multiple operation and maintenance bases or just 1, 2, or 3?
Well, I think we know there's a certain number of ports and facilities, and we want to be as smart and as efficient as possible. So, we're scanning what the options would be, and we'll evaluate them. So, no, we've not determined that yet, but certainly where there's opportunity to coordinate, I think that's for the better for all. That's great. It's certainly the inspiration behind what Scottish Government and the SIM model is trying to do, but I think developers just need to really understand their own needs first so that you can have constructive conversations.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Now, some more questions from the audience. We've got this one's come through. Have you considered the emergency response and planned maintenance of the various components in the design stages? There are some 12,000 individual components on the average wind turbine in these large projects, for example. 12,000 components. That's a lot. Susie, would you like to go first?
I think we'll have to get into the detail as to what our strategy is, but clearly this question illustrates how complex the technology is and the elements are, and of course different people will have responsibility for different parts of this depending on our strategy to procurement and construction. So it will be something that we'll think about very carefully. Certainly in terms of emergency response, health and safety is always our top priority. So it'll be a focus from that point of view, as well as making sure that turbines are spinning for as long as possible so that we can really leverage maximum output from them.
Absolutely. And actually, Dan McGrail, what's your take on this, Dan?
Well, part of me wants to remind everybody that this is not new. We've been doing wind turbine, offshore wind maintenance. We've got, in certain parts of the UK, pretty big O&M bases built up. So we've got a really, a real concentration of O&M expertise in the Humber and in particular in Grimsby, where both Ørsted and RWE have significant bases. We have a considerable amount of CTVs and CTV maintenance facilities, and you also have the offshore renewable energies catapults, digital O&M centre of excellence. So you've got a lot of backbone around that. I think when it comes to floating, in particular the further away from shore and the particular challenges that arise from floating wind turbines, there are big technical questions that I think we need to answer. How do we do major component exchange if there is a fault? When you are in deep water, is there an evolution of something like a hot swap? For a a gas turbine on a rig, would you look at similar kind of concepts for that, and how might that work, and where would the wet storage be and things like that? So there's sort of interesting questions about how you deal with that logistical challenge once you move further offshore into deep water where you can't easily jack up a vessel. But in terms of maintaining these machines, we know what we're doing on this, and we've been doing it pretty well for a while. So I think the uptime on offshore wind farms now is close to 99%, and we're and with pretty sophisticated supply chain around it.
Great. And Dan Jackson, there's only 4 years to go before your first turbine spinning. This must be something you put a lot of thought into.
Yeah, so it's all about scale. I think we touched on this at the beginning of the call. When does the scale come in? So for Cerulean, we're trying to provide cost-effective power to the oil and gas industry, and that comes with the large-scale floating wind farms. And what is that scale? As the price comes down with scale, you get redundancy, and the impact of one turbine in that 99% reference. If you've got 100 turbines and one is down, and how do you manage that, becomes far less of an impact on the overall performance of the wind farm. But it is actually about scale. It's about manufacturing processes, producing hundreds of these units, and therefore the impact of the 1%, if it is 1%, we can challenge that, but if it is 1%, becomes far less, because you've got to provide reliability and consistency from production of the wind farm, and you'd struggle to do that for a small wind farm if you had a challenging customer base like the oil and gas industry that absolutely needs 100% reliability, availability to the best it can be. So yeah, scale, absolutely brilliant, super.
Now, Alan Stewart's given us a couple of questions. Hi, Alan. The local and Scottish supply chain is ready, but needs forward commitment from developers so that the ports, equipment, training, etc. can be started, knowing full well the orders are coming their way. Early engagement for all is required. When does the panel feel that developers will commit? Well, Dan, it seems like you're going to get gold stars today because you've already committed, right?
So our prime contractors are in place, and I can tell you daily meetings that we get feedback from dealing with yards and ports in Scotland as they're working through placing the next tier of subcontracts in place. So our expectations are the commitments are made this year, where people are starting to see what we need. You need designs, you need a schedule, and you need a pipeline of business that's sufficiently large that a supplier can move into the position from an oil and gas business to a renewables business. And in the floating wind business, that's what we're doing. So our prime contractors are having those discussions, are down selecting their supply base, and they're therefore able to make the investments. And the investments aren't, in our world, we're not looking for our suppliers to make, sub-suppliers to make massive commercial investments. I think the investments in people, training, and people and training and skills is probably the critical path. It's easy to pour concrete, and it's easy to buy a bigger crane. It is not easy to train certain skill sets that takes years that we need quickly.
Great. And Susie, your project, of course, is taking a different approach. When do you think your projects will be ready to commit to these things?
Well, I entirely agree with Alan's comment. So we want that to be as soon as possible, but it's really important that to have well designed, well thought out projects, that we do take the time to really understand, select the technology as you described, but then also respect the constraints that will be implicit through the consenting regime, because there's quite a lot of volume to be delivered, of course, and a complicated burden environmental context to this as well. So we're working, very methodically, but as quickly as possible, really, to accelerate the point in time where we'll have certainty. There's many things that we can, and already if you go on the Bellrock and Broadshaw websites, for example, supply chain can register and always have the latest view of the project's progress. But there'll be much more certainty towards the end of next year and into 2025 as to the specifics of timeframes and what's going to be delivered.
Brilliant. And one from Colin Fraser here. Hey, Colin. Just a thought, but it seems to me there's a huge financial risk in the successful execution of these proposed developments, but it's not clear to me, at least, as to whose money is at risk. Actually, that's a thought. Can you both give us an idea? What sort of budgets are we talking about here for these projects? Susie, can you go first?
For the full development phase?
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite variable depending on grid and other things, but
Okay.
you know, it's tens of millions of pounds over 8-year period, 6 to 8 year period of development timeline. So I'll let LinkedIn users do the maths, but
Yeah.
significant investment per project. Obviously,
Absolutely.
for Dan and for myself, we've got a portfolio and we're able to massively leverage the synergies across the portfolio. So that is very helpful. We don't see it as a risk. We're developers. We see this as a natural step, you know, and ultimately operators. But we, as Dan McGrail has said, we've done many of these elements before. Mm-hmm. And we're going to leverage learnings from oil and gas, for example, in terms of subsea or nautical engineers, you know, to make sure that actually we're using learnings that exist already in Scotland, amplifying them, training the new workforce, and we're able to, coming back to the point that we talked about at the start of the show, develop projects that banks have confidence in, because of course those commitment numbers scale up massively into the billions at the point of FID into construction for our CapEx phase. And so I think that's the key thing, is making sure that we are very transparent with the story of why these things are not risky, why they're a process that we need to have confidence in.
Great. And whose money is at risk?
Ultimately, our shareholders and funders. So
yes,
in my case, Renantis is owned by JP Morgan, and Blueflow Energy is owned by 547 and Quantum Energy Partners. So you know, these are people that understand development risk and have mixed portfolios across many clean energies, but have great confidence in floating wind.
Perfect. And Dan Jackson?
So our capex number is £20 billion, which is a huge number, and you de-risk that by having an integrated energy scheme with multiple markets. Our primary purpose of the INTOG's success was to decarbonize the oil and gas industry. To provide what the oil and gas industry needs, it needs to be cost effective and needs to have a high availability of green energy. So we have a lot of excess power from the scheme. That excess power has to go to markets where it can be monetized. So you'll see from the NSR grid, the project, it has multiple grid connections, both in the UK and Europe. It has a large transmission system. What we are doing is we are accessing multiple markets. So you de-risk the project by having multiple offtake opportunities. That benefits the oil and gas industry because it provides cheaper power and it's a larger scale, so it provides greater availability of green energy. And just to reiterate what Susie says, the market is, there's a very strong market for development phase funding. Both Susie and Cerulean are in the what they call a mid-phase development funding phase. There's a lot of appetite and liquidity to take projects through development because that £20 billion is coming from the financial markets, and there is a long queue of people to invest in these type of large-scale infrastructure projects. So actually, as you de-risk it as you go through, the trick is to make sure that you're not totally reliant on one offtake, one market, one grid connection. It has to be diversified and has to be an integrated energy scheme.
Great. I've got 2 more questions, and then I want to speak to Dan McGrail about next week some more, and then we're going to bring David Linden back in just quickly. So the first question we've got here, I'll try and put this on screen, but essentially Justin Hoffman is asking, we're active in US offshore wind projects now, so appreciate the importance of local content. We're starting to support SDI with finding product, technology and service providers keen to fill any gaps in the supply chain in Scotland by increasing local content. Are Scottish companies, 2 seconds guys, I'll take that off again. Are Scottish companies looking to establish and invest in Scotland getting preferential opportunities for your projects? Who would like to answer that one? Go on, Susie.
Well, it depends what we mean by preferential, but it's absolutely they're our favourite. They're exactly what we want to be doing. We want to be, as I think Dan said before, developing these and servicing them in Scotland by Scotland. So that's crystal clear. Yeah.
Great. And Dan Jackson, just quickly on that one.
Yeah, I think we've covered this. I can't reiterate enough the opportunity for Scotland, and perhaps worth also saying that I think it's young people and careers in Scotland where you're really focusing on the investment in people, because you want the young people to think or to believe that there's opportunities to stay in Scotland and build a substantial career in renewables, particularly in the high-tech sector.
Thank you very much. And we're just going to wrap up in a second. In fact, we're going to quickly go back to David Linden just in a second. Dan McGrail, tell us. So next week, we've got Global Offshore Wind. The exhibition's sold out, but there are still visitors' tickets available, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You can buy tickets via our website or contact our team, and that's RenewableUK.com. Or just Google Global Offshore Wind 2023. And yeah, we're expecting to see the biggest show that we've ever had. And we've got the UK Energy Minister Graham Stewart. We've got the Opposition Energy Minister Miliband, and we'll also be welcoming Gillian Martin from Scottish Government as well over the course of 2 days. So we'll be hearing a lot of the political dimensions, but as well, of course, lots about innovation and lots about sort of the key topics in the industry. So yeah, really welcome as many people.
Brilliant. I'm certainly looking forward to it. It's a fantastic event. That's on Wednesday and Thursday of next week, and the entire offshore wind industry will be there. It is well worth visiting. Good. Well, look, Dan, and Susie, thank you all so much for joining us today. I think you've been great guests, and thank you for working with us through those little technical glitches. I'll see you next week, and in the meantime, I'm going to bring back David. Thank you very much, guys. Hi, David.
Hey, Moray.
So, just 5 minutes, David. You've been waiting patiently again. New glitches. So, for our guests, those of you who are watching, David Linden, Executive Director at Westwood Global. David is his team are the guys with the brains. They are the analysts that check all the numbers and tell us where the action is, where it's going to be, and what's changing. So, David, give us just a couple of minutes worth of what are the markets to watch for, what's changing, and why.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I guess this is for the folks who missed our conversation up front in some respects, but thank you for giving me this time. I guess essentially we were talking about the kind of the origins of the industry being Europe, and how China's had a massive impact over the last couple of years, and we're looking at a market which is almost 50% Europe in terms of current capacity split, and the rest of it, sort of 47%, the rest of it sort of China, and then you've got other sort of spatterings around the world. But it's really, the story going forward is about diversification and growth, right? So you're going to get significant growth somewhere like 350 or so gigawatts, so 350 gigawatts from today, 65 gigawatts by the end of this decade even, and significantly beyond that. And many other countries really picking up the baton and running with it. Places like the US and Japan really taking up new additional tenders to what they've got already, and new countries that are close to home here, places like Norway and Portugal running their first tenders. And then the longer term story is very much about Brazil, Colombia, India, Philippines, all these other kind of countries that have been looking at it and really seeing the opportunity for growth.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate it. Thank you for all of your patience. Does anybody have any questions for David? I guess not. I guess we've gone a little bit over time. But David, look, thank you very much for joining us. I really look forward to seeing you next week and to finding out more about the great products that Westwood Global's got coming to the market, especially the WindLogic. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much for joining us.
Much appreciated, Moray. Thanks for having me.
So everybody, that brings us towards the end of our show. Before I go, thank you everybody for bearing with us through those glitches, especially for the LinkedIn users. That was annoying, but we got there. We found out, and thank you so much for joining us from so far afield as well. We've had visitors from Peru, from Pakistan, from all over the world. Thank you so much. Do remember that the OGV Renewables, OGV Energy magazine is coming out next week. That's the next issue. Of course, we've got Flotation Energy on the cover there. And inside, you'll see some brilliant interviews. We've got Davis Larson, the Chief Executive of ProServe. We've got Kieran Ivers, the Chief Executive of the innovative Irish survey contractor Green Rebel. We've got Adam Morrison, the General Manager at Ocean Winds, and lots more. So remember, you can find the podcasts at ogv.energy. And if you would like to take part in any of our shows, whether it be live or on the podcasts or join the magazine, remember, get in touch. It's murray@anetconsulting.com. Thank you very much, everybody. And I'm sure I'll see you all next week. Thank you.